Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some insights on the blue economy. It's a concept of sustainable development applied to the maritime economy. And this is an area of work I've been doing since my time in Asian Institute of Management and now also in Ateneo. It's a pleasure for me to speak to you today about this particular topic. Let me begin with this image, which is probably quite ubiquitous in the Philippine fisheries sector. It's a 95 kilo yellowfin tuna somewhere in Palawan, and you will see the workers actually hauling in this catch. Such a tuna, I'm told, can fetch anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 in foreign market, and of course here in the Philippines, it fetches a lot less than this. But you can imagine that the workers actually engaged in this area are not very well paid, and the area itself may not necessarily be, um, you know, utilizing extensive technology and extensive value-adding processes and technologies, so that it's very much harvesting and direct exportation of some of these products with very little value added. Now, this image is an image in Singapore. This is actually a vertical farmer who is raising crabs and fattening crabs. And this sells at about 30 to 35 kilos, at least during the time when we collected this information. And it sells in the wholesale market at around $40 to $48 a kilo. So certainly quite lucrative, high technology, utilizing a lot of research in order to enhance productivity. And it is the kind of investment in the maritime sector that we in the Philippines have not yet been able to deploy. And you can see the vast difference between this entrepreneur and the Filipino in the previous image. A big difference in terms of productivity and therefore also in terms of incomes. So the reality for us in the Philippine fisheries and maritime sector is that this sector is characterized by high poverty. These are figures from 2018, and the fisher folk actually are second only to farmers in terms of poverty incidence. So in 2015, the poverty incidence in this area was about 37%, but in 2018, it became about 27%. And we expect that the pandemic is not likely to have improved this, may even have exacerbated poverty in this area, despite the clear importance of the fisheries sector in terms of our food security. So here is the formal definition of what I'm talking about. And those figures in the previous slides gave you a sense of the overall challenge we're facing in terms of the blue economy. So the blue economy, put simply, is a version of the green economy made relevant to seas and oceans. So everyone is more or less familiar with the green economy concept, which is the sustainable development of the economy, mostly having to deal with the terrestrial sector. The development of the blue economy is fairly recent, and it followed the discussions in terms of the possible importance of the maritime economy. And it emphasizes the sustainable management of marine resources. And because of the advancements in technology in this area, there appears to be more and more economic promise in terms of the blue economy. Now, of course, you might say that I'm a little slightly biased in terms of the color blue, but I guess this is a tongue-in-cheek sort of presentation or framing of how important the blue economy is vis-a-vis the green economy. So nothing wrong with green economy. It's something we should pursue as well. But the blue economy is especially important, at least I would say, for a country like the Philippines for various reasons. First, the marine economy or the marine zones account for about 86% of the Philippines' total territory. And this is just the sovereign zones where we have control. And the Philippines is the second largest archipelagic country in the world. We are second only to Indonesia. We have the fifth longest coastline in the world, and we control, or within our territory, we have 70% of the Coral Triangle, which is the richest area in terms of marine biodiversity declared by scientists. And finally, the world's 10th largest fishing catch, that's the Philippines, the fourth largest shipbuilding industry, thanks to foreign investments in this area, and the leading provider of global maritime manpower. So many OFWs that are actually working in the marine sector, in ships, in uh, cruise lines, and also in cargo ships, and of course in ports. This is a very, very large, or it accounts for a large segment of our overseas Filipino workers. So part of our work has been to value the marine ecosystems, and with valuation comes an appreciation of how important they are to our economy and also to our national security. So in collaboration with scientists from the UP Marine Science Institute, and I'm mentioning here Dr. Rod Asansa, who's been a longtime partner. More recently, we have been working with Sec Ernie Pernia as well. We've been working with the Department of Foreign Affairs since actually around 20, uh, roughly about 2013, to develop this concept and to try and apply it to us here in the Philippines. And we've come up with this figure. This is a study we did in collaboration with DFA, that the conservative monetary value that the marine ecosystems in our territory can contribute to the Philippine economy in PPP US dollars in 2007 prices is roughly in the neighborhood of $970 billion to $1.5 trillion dollars. So this is a publication that we came out with Dr. Rhoda Sansa in 2017. This gives us a sense of how important the marine economy is to our overall economy, even though we know that this is an invested area, and certainly a sector that has not yet been the main focus of our development efforts. So the Philippine blue economy, what are the promises in this area? Well, according to the emerging science from other countries, and also developed by some of our scientists, vertical ocean farming, which can produce a lot of food for our people as we emerge in our development, and we have a growing middle class with a growing um, demand for higher value food. The vertical ocean farming in the maritime sector can also play a key role in satisfying this demand, and also the demand from other fast-growing countries with growing middle class, like China and also large parts of ASEAN. The ocean-based renewable energy is also an area where scientific developments have been increasing lately. And there has been a lot of technology harnessing tidal wave power, marine biofuels for sustainable and reliable energy that has been piloted and applied in other countries and may potentially be a source of investments and scientific breakthrough when applied here to our country, to the Philippines. And then finally, marine biotechnology, marine biodiversity products for health, cosmetic, environmental, and nutritional purposes, given the sheer size of our marine sector. So all of these potential, we hope to explore in a very sustainable way, such that it does not destroy the potential for the maritime sector to contribute, to sustainably contribute to our development for the longer haul. So that's the key here, is to be able to develop this sector without actually destroying the systems that underpin its sustainability. Now, in terms of the industrial development in the blue economy, which also relates to our national security, this is extremely important. This is a poster that I saw if I recall correctly, in Canberra when I visited Australia. And I saw this in their airport, True Blue. So essentially, they have an appreciation of their blue economy as well. And of course, Austal is one of their big shipbuilding companies in Australia, an investor that is likely to also look at the Philippines as a destination for some of its investments, if not already. If I recall correctly, they were looking at Subic as a potential investment destination. And here, I just want to point out that the slogan actually could be something that we ourselves could learn from. It says here, designed for Australia and built by Australians. And certainly, this is the kind of shipbuilding industry that we also may be interested to develop in the Philippines. And we certainly have a semblance, or at least some um, emerging capabilities in the shipbuilding industry, thanks to sufficiently large foreign investments in this area in the past 2 or 3 decades. And these are some of the ships that we have already made in the Philippines, or at least assembled in the Philippines. But the challenge, of course, is that in terms of the value added, we are still stuck mainly with assembly and manufacturing of these ships. Most of the materials are actually imported since we don't have a steel industry to speak of. And our challenge is to develop the upstream and downstream capabilities, which are higher value added and higher paying in terms of the higher quality jobs that they are creating. So for upstream, design and development and R&D, these are areas that we should really be thinking of investing in and developing. And then for downstream, there's marketing and brand management to develop our own Philippine brand in this area. And then also sales and service, to the extent that this also allows for greater growth in export markets. If you want an analogous story, that is potentially the automobile industry. So these are some of the directions that we hope our shipbuilding industry will also take, but they are requiring a lot of investments, but also good governance in order to get us moving in these directions and increase value added in this sector. So until we do that, the Philippine maritime sector is actually playing a very small role, and actually has a very small footprint in our formal GDP. In our informal GDP, it could actually be playing a much bigger role, since we all know that the GDP does not fully take into consideration all the value and all the information, particularly the public goods benefits from certain sectors, notably the maritime sector. But it shows here that in terms of total employed labor force, the total employed as a share of the maritime sector, or the maritime sector as a share of total employed, is very, very small at 4.3%. And in terms of the total output is also quite small at 1.3%. And yet there's a lot of promise, and I'll just round off the presentation here by talking about some of it. Benham Rice, or formerly Benham Rice, now called Philippine Rice, is a 13 million hectare underwater plateau located near Aurora, the province of Aurora. And it is larger than Luzon and potentially contains a rich source of natural gas and heavy metals. So this is certainly an area that could prove quite promising in terms of contributing to our economy if sustainably developed, and if we are able to attract enough foreign investments with the right type of technology that they can bring to the Philippines. As I mentioned already earlier, in terms of energy sources, the ocean can provide a lot of sustainable energy and renewable energy. So ocean energy thermal conversion is one of those areas that scientists are now developing and even piloting in different parts of the country. And a study by Mindanao State University researchers showed that the Philippine ocean resources around 1,000 square kilometer area could generate about 170,000 megawatts of power. So just for comparison, this is 10 times the peak demand in 2019, prior to the pandemic. So this is indeed quite promising if these are the types of technologies that can be broadly applied and commercialized and used in favor of our economic development and continued sustainable development as a country. So these are some of the projects that are now being developed. 7 projects as far as DOE, and this was actually a dated figure. This was reported in 2017. I can imagine that some of the projects may be delayed because of the pandemic, but certainly the promise of these types of projects remain as a source of renewable energy. In terms of tidal in-stream energy conversion, TISEC, this is another way of basically transforming that energy from the ocean into energy that we can use for our development and industrialization. There are several firms that are already investing in the Philippines. And here is just further information for those interested in terms of pioneering tidal stream energy, which presumably are still in play, though I wouldn't be surprised if they're somewhat delayed because of the pandemic right now. But these are all, just to emphasize that these are all very promising sources of renewable energy for our people and for our economy. Now, since I've been talking about the promise of the blue economy for the Philippines, I also want to emphasize the different policies that other countries have been putting in place in order to develop more extensively this sector in their economies. And we can learn a lot from how other countries have actually moved ahead in terms of emphasizing the blue economy in their respective development plans. For Singapore, they have initiatives to boost the maritime industry and have created technology funds to keep investments pouring into research and development into this sector. They have also implemented simplified procedures so as to lower the cost of transacting and investing in this area. And they have also implemented the Maritime Sector Incentive Scheme, which allows for streamlined tax incentives for shipping companies and other investors in this area. And so Singapore is one of those countries that is making a play to become a shipping hub in the region. And of course, it is already a transport hub in terms of air transport. And you know, of course, how many, the prominent role played by Singapore Airlines, for instance, in terms of travel in ASEAN. But Singapore is also thinking of becoming a major shipping hub, and hence is pursuing many of these reforms to make it easier for investors to look at it as a potential shipping hub. Now, the Vietnam is another country, and it has a sea strategy, which is called Sea Strategy up to 2020, where it aims for the maritime sector to contribute anywhere from 20 to 56% of its GDP by 2014. By 2020. And it is also in the process of developing up to 15 coastal economic parks, with the maritime industry as the leading economic sector, followed by oil and gas, seafood, and tourism industry. So it has a game plan to try and elevate the importance of the maritime sector in its continued industrialization and development. And it also wishes to see this develop in a very inclusive way so that it continues to reduce poverty and increase the standard of living of coastal residents. Its target is to increase their standard of living by 2.5 times. So that is also an area that we need to focus in, not just to funnel investments and technology into sectors and private incentives into sectors, but also to make sure that impetus for development is very inclusive, such that many of those workers that I just showed you the image in the beginning of this presentation would also benefit from this kind of development. It will be job generating. It will generate good, better paying jobs, which will hopefully create the middle class that also appreciates better the importance of the blue economy in our future. So this is the good dynamic that of development that we would really like to see, where the development of the blue economy reduces poverty, creates a middle class, and a middle class that appreciates the importance of protecting the sustainable use of the maritime sector or the blue economy itself. Now, Indonesia is another country, and of course, it is the most archipelagic country in the world. It is the first in the ranking, and we are the second. And it created a vision of development called the Global Maritime Fulcrum, where it sees the blue economy playing a key role, not just in their economy, but also in terms of their national security, given the importance of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and how Indonesia sort of straddles this area. And it has also created well, as I mentioned, the Global Maritime Fulcrum Vision, which envisions a coherent strategy and set of policies around the development of this sector, so that it will become um, a major player in the blue economy, at least, well, according to its vision, globally. Now, before I end with the government policies, I also wanted to emphasize that some of it is actually cooperative in nature. So international cooperation is a key ingredient in the blue economy. Why? Because there are key aspects of the blue economy that requires cooperation across countries. It cannot just be managed by one country alone, because the ecosystems that underpin the blue economy, the marine ecosystems, actually are almost borderless. They transcend different national borders, and therefore require the cooperation of these nations in their protection and in their sustainable development. So here I just wanted to mention that the Philippines plays a key role in this, because 70% of the Coral Triangle is in areas where Philippines has control, and it is considered the center of marine biodiversity in the world, surpassing even the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. So globally, we are quite distinct as a country in terms of our sheer influence on the most biodiverse, marine biodiverse area in the entire planet. And this is the Coral Triangle, where 70% of that area is actually in Philippine territory. And just to emphasize the importance of that, as most of you will probably know by now, spawning grounds for much of the food resources, such as bluefin tuna, are actually in different parts of the region, the Asian region, and are in different parts of our country. But when they are in our country and being protected in our country, they are nevertheless harvested partly outside of our country and benefiting other countries in terms of that harvesting. So it really requires a systems-based approach, systems-based lens to appreciate that a country protecting food resources may actually be benefiting many other countries, and therefore creating the possible incentives for cooperation and support for that protection, and also underpinning the science and evidence base behind managing sustainably the harvesting of these resources, so that they can continue to spawn, continue to be part of that sustainable ecosystem. Once you destroy that, or parts of those ecosystems, or disturb them, you may actually be impacting on the food security, not just of that country, but of other countries as well in the region. So these are important points that we need to consider, particularly when we're thinking of development projects in this area of the blue economy. So as far as threats and vulnerability, I just wanted to emphasize a few, and I don't want to belabor this point. The degradation of coastal ecosystems. So Philippines has endangered reefs, and one of the most one of the countries with the most amount of reefs endangered, with 98% of reefs at risk from human activities, according to World Resources Institute. And this was reported in 2012. Obviously, this needs some updating, and it could actually be just as large as this today, or even slightly larger. The case is still the same in 2011, when the WRI reported again the Philippine coastal reefs are included in the most endangered. And the numbers of endangered marine and coastal species are also rising over time, with 625 threatened fish species in 2010. And again, if you think about this from a systems-based perspective, if these resources are not able to replenish themselves, then we could actually have real negative food security implications if they are endangered into extinction. And part of the challenge, of course, again, Philippine artisanal fishermen are already being affected by illegal fishing, even within our municipal waters. So the unsustainable harvesting of some of these fish resources are threatening the ability of the system to replenish itself, which then threatens the long-term survivability of the ecosystem itself, and threatens our food security also in that longer term. So the PSA has been reporting that The catch of our artisanal vessels, these are the smaller, less technologically equipped vessels, have been on a steady downward trend in the last 10 years, peaking in 2010 at 2.4 million metric tons and reaching a low of 1.9 million metric tons in 2020. So this is a really bad sign, and also shows the stress in terms of the productivity of the artisanal fishing sector. So even with the same effort, they are actually catching less. And this is a sector that we know already has a lot of has a lot of poverty. So this kind of decline in productivity is also threatening those poor families even more. A recent report of DA BIFAR and the USAID Fish Rights estimates that municipalities lose anywhere from 275,000 to 402,000 metric tons per year to illegal fishing. So this is a sheer large amount of loss for many of the fisher folk that can actually probably explain why they are remaining poor and why they are stuck in poverty, because a lot of the resources are actually taken from from them, and they are becoming less productive because of this unsustainable harvesting of those resources. Then there's also bad governance, and I don't want to belabor the point here that there are many examples of um, bad governance in the maritime sector across the country. I'm sure you're familiar with black sand mining and the governance issues attached there to the north of the country. Then there are leaders who do not understand or do not try to understand the science of these marine systems and the sustainability necessary for keeping them protected by ordering the killing of certain types of species, whales and sharks, thinking that would actually result in more catch for the fisher folk, when in fact it will disturb the ecosystem and may in fact destroy it because of this kind of behavior. And then also the unsustainable development of tourism in some parts of the country, which also threatens that very industry itself and threatens to turn away tourists eventually because of the unsustainable development and unsustainable aspects of that industry. So these are all aspects of bad governance which we must overcome in order to continue to develop this sector, but in ways that are much more sustainable. There is also, I just briefly mentioned this, the threat of sea level rise, which primarily affects our coastal regions. And our coastal regions are where our fishermen and fisher folk are. And obviously, the fisher folk are actually among the poorest in the country already. So this kind of risk faced by many of our fellow Filipinos in the coastal region it's like a double whammy in terms of their declining productivity and at the same time increasing risk in terms of climate change. So thinking again in terms of systems, our shift to more sustainable and more renewable energy sources allows us to mitigate or at least contribute to the mitigation of climate change. And at the same time, also, we need to invest in ways to mitigate the harm and the risk that many of our fisher folk face, particularly as their main means of living are affected by over harvesting, and also because of the immediate impacts of climate change. And then finally, there's also the issue of national security, as I've been mentioning several times already in the beginning, that there is much at stake in terms of some of the disputes our country is now involved in. China is claiming 85.7% of the waters of the South China Sea, where over one half of the world's seaborne trade passes, with a value of about 5.3 trillion annually. So there is a lot of stake in terms of that maritime real estate that we're talking about. And there's also a lot of resources at stake for us, the Philippines. So Malampaya's reserve, which is due to run out this year without an alternative, as noted by some of our national security experts. And this increases the importance of the other contested areas in the West Philippine Sea, Reed Bank alone could hold up to, according to some estimates, 135 times the oil and up to 16 times the amount of natural gas deposits of Malampaya. And this, of course, increases even more the stake in terms of what types of resources could be achieved by our country if we were able to assert our rights in these areas much, much more successfully. And then also linked to national security, because we have very porous borders and in some places very bad governance of our borders. Then obviously the threat of terrorism and these other uh, border incursions are part of what we need to deal with, and especially in the southern part of the country where this is an acute risk. And so international cooperation is as I noted, necessary in terms of addressing some of these emerging risks. One example is the Sulu Sea Initiative, which sees the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia agreeing to undertake trilateral patrols in the Sulu, Sulawesi seas to combat terrorism, piracy, kidnapping, and other crimes in the area. Now, I will begin to wrap up the presentation with a suggestion that may be considered by your group and also by different provinces in the Philippines in terms of better marine spatial planning as a tool for better governance of the blue economy. And What is marine spatial planning? It's a practical way to organize the use of the ocean space, organize around human uses and between uses and the marine environment, the system that you need to protect. It is an integrated framework for management, and it has been developed and applied in other countries. There are actually applications in the country already, but not yet widespread. And it is a continuous and interactive process that should be regularly funded and adapted with a planning cycle that is recurrent and that requires engagement of multiple actors and stakeholders at various governmental and societal levels. So it allows for an inclusivity in the decision making and a transparency in the decision making that is supposed to also make the decisions much more credible, much more accepted by the public, and hopefully better governed by the number of stakeholders involved in terms of those who are affected, but also those who are going to benefit from investments in the blue economy. So there are three areas that can be included in such marine spatial planning. Obviously, environmental is one of them, and I won't belabor that point. But the social area can actually be figured in to the extent that many stakeholders can be affected by investments and developments, either as beneficiaries or affected communities in the blue economy. It can improve opportunities for public and stakeholder engagement in ocean use management, which may also potentially increase the ownership of such policies and the sustainability of such policies. And finally, it is also impinging on the economic space by increasing the certainty for private sector investments, which are necessary, as I mentioned several times already. Much of the technology that we need is not yet in the Philippines, and yet we can import these technologies with foreign investors partnering with our domestic investors in order for us to rapidly catch up in terms of the necessary technologies for a more successful drive for growth in the blue economy. So marine spatial planning in the Philippines, as I put together this presentation several years back, it was Bataan and Batangas that were the key examples. There could be some more examples here. I haven't been able to update this, but certainly Bataan and Batangas are among the leaders and the provinces we can learn from in terms of marine spatial planning. Bataan currently in phase 6 in terms of implementation and adopted already the MSP in 2006. And Batangas MSP for Batangas Bay Area was developed in 99 and adopted also in 2006. So somewhat many years ago, and can actually potentially offer lessons already at this stage for many other provinces. And of course, the good governance in the blue economy should redound to a stronger, more fully developed blue economy that involves strong public-private partnerships. So that's key also in the blue economy. And is probably going to be a channel for increased investments, increased technology transfer for our country, and also increased benefits for the domestic stakeholders, the fisher folk, the coastal communities that can immediately benefit from some of those developments through job creation that is higher value adding, and also slightly better paid than the image that I showed you in the beginning of this presentation, which is still describing our underinvested, technology lacking blue economy at this stage in the country's development. But I must say that as a proponent and advocate of the development of the blue economy, that we hold a lot of potential as a country, and it's something that should certainly be figured into our development plans. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you for listening to this presentation on the blue economy, and I look forward to discussing this topic further with you.